Hello again. Right, today we're ready to start on the frame modifications for the Trials bike. As you can see, we've got it mounted up into the jig, so the engine mountings here are firmly connected and the frame's going to stay rigid even when we remove the top tube, which is going to be our first job. We're going to cut through the frame tube, grind off the welds on the plate here and cut through this tube here. Then we're going to cut it out the back here so this entire piece will come off. Next stage is to make a small cross piece to fit in here. Then we will put the forks in, use the mounting I'd mentioned here to bring the head down as we heat this frame. Then we will cut a piece of thin walled moly tubing to put in here. When that's sorted, we're going to come back to here. Now you'll notice here the original swinging suspension unit mounts were right up here, whereas the new one is going to be down here, as you can see on the mounting point for the jig. So what we will do is we will turn two pieces, which you'll see. They will be mounted into the jig here, and these two tubes will be cut and slightly brought in so they can be bronze welded to that mounting. Then we'll cut two pieces to go from here to our new cross piece, and then finally we will make up two pieces to go from here to a mudguard mounting plate there. That will basically be the frame into the geometry that we want it to be. Then we'll start doing the minor things such as cutting off plates and lugs. The mounting for the center stand will come off. We'll cut all of these little bits and pieces that we're on to put the rubber mountings for the side covers on to get everything the way we want. Then we will put on some more plate here to mount the footrests, and that is basically all the framework done. The very final parts are things like when we've got the engine in and we know where the exhaust is going to be, then we'll bronze on our mounting for the silencer. Right, so as Sod's law, or Murphy's law as it is here, would dictate, no matter where I put the camera or how well I protect it, once I start using a cutting wheel to take this out, it's going to get covered in little bits of molten metal. So what I'm going to do is switch off now, cut this piece out, and then we'll come back to see the actual fabrication. Stage 1 completed. We've taken out the entire oil tank part, and with a lot of grinding we've cleaned the headstock up and all this around here, and we've cleaned and got this prepared to put our cross piece in. So this little bit here will go into there, we'll bronze that in, then we can pull the head down and put the piece in there. So let's get the torch going and we will bronze this in. Warm up a fair bit of the metal, making sure both pieces are getting the same temperature. Then we introduce the rod. Slowly working the rod into the joint, not letting it get too hot. Then we'll fasten in the other side. I'll move round the other side so you can still see the bronzing. You'll notice that I use the coated rods. They already have the flux on them, which makes things a lot easier. It lets it flow in a lot quicker. Again, we get the metal we're joining warmed up nicely, and then we start to flow the bronze in. Not letting it get too hot so it doesn't just flow through all the little gaps. It really is very fluid when it's molten, so you'll find that if you've got any gaps, it'll just disappear into them if you have it too hot. So you've got to keep it in that semi-molten state that I mentioned before, and then you can just and even where we've already put some in, we can put some extra in, because as I said, we can keep this semi-molten sort of state for it. There we go. Now I'll move the camera over so you can actually have a look at the weld itself. There's the weld, or whatever you want to call it, but since it is known as bronze welding, I would call it welding. Here you can see some of the flux. The flux should really be washed off with nice hot water, but it will generally just come off with a tap, the same as ordinary welding flux does. And of course, when the frame is sandblasted, it's going to get it all off. But certainly if you do bronze weld, you want to make sure you get the flux really cleaned off, because the sodium borate that's in the flux will come up and crack underneath the paint if you don't get it off, and it'll just look really nasty and ruin your paintwork. So next thing is to put the forks in. Alright, now we'll put the forks in. One nice thing about the B25 is they've gone away from having just balls in a race and gone to having tapered roller bearings. So, and nice alloy yokes as well. So all in all, forks and yokes are much lighter and have much better bearings than the earlier frames. We'll just get that tightened onto there. Thus. Bang. As we all know, nothing ever goes right or easy. BSA forks still have tapered tops, so the actual top nut pulls that right into there. So we will need an appropriate one and a half inch socket, which is being turned into a special tool because it's also the size of the nut that holds the gearbox sprocket on. Get that one in there. This one needs pushing up a bit more. There we go, so we can get some threads on it. A bit more. Come on, you bugger. There it is. Now we can catch. That. So there we have one pair of forks in there. Now we'll attach our little pulling device. I don't know if you can notice here, but there's a narrower part turned into the spindle. That's because with these forks the outer two studs are actually closer together. So if you actually look at the wheel spindle in a BSA or Triumph wheel that uses these forks, you'll see that little channel turned into there. So consequently, of course, we had to do it as well. So that gets screwed into there. Hold that in place. Now I mentioned Sod's Law earlier, and of course I couldn't find any end caps, so we're just going to have to go with a couple of little bits of alloy to hold that in there. As these forks come off the later British bikes, virtually all of the nuts and bolts have been converted to UNF and UNC threads instead of the British Standard Whitworth and British Standard Fine and British Standard Cycle and CEI and so on that we used to have on them. In fact, actually with the later 60s bikes, when they were converting from the old pattern to the new pattern, you would find old, new, all sorts of bolts, so you've really got to be careful when you're putting things on. Alright, we'll finish bolting that up and then we can heat this up and start to pull it in. Alright, here we go. We're going to start heating it down here at the bottom. It's going to have almost a two-point curve to it. It curves a little at the bottom and then it curves more at the top. Don't forget, when you do this tube used to be part of the oil tank, so there are going to be oil residues in it. So if you have the oil fitting out of the bottom and the holes at the top, you're not going to have any problems with vapor explosions, even with lubricating oils. And it's worthwhile to have something underneath, because there's thick old oil in there that'll liquefy and thin and come out the bottom. Now for those of you looking and saying, oh wow, he's heating this up, he's affecting the tensile strength of the tube and all the rest of it. Well, that's quite true. But this is quite a wide diameter tube, and it's not going to be particularly stressed, and it's pretty thick walled, and all in all, we're not really going to compromise the frame at all doing this. Certainly not for the purposes that this frame is going to be put to. So once you feel you've got it red all the way around, you don't want any parts that haven't been heated up to this sort of cherry red colour, because they wouldn't bend as easily as the parts that are heated to temperature, so you'd get some rather strange stresses that might pull it over to one side. So here we go. Moved it across till it's touching our little guide there. As whenever you're bending tubing with heat like this, you don't just heat it up where you want the bend to be, otherwise it'll almost certainly kink, because that would be the only small part of the tube that would be wanting to bend. You've got to heat it up a good way on either side of where your bend is, so that it takes a nice gentle curve as it begins to bend. The other thing, of course, is to keep the flame moving. This is the burning torch head on here, so if you leave it in one place too long, you've got a good chance of just burning a hole through the tube. And of course, you don't want to do that. See, we're starting to get a nice redness over about an 8-inch. And then the tube. had the other frame in the jig, measured what the headstock angle should be. So using our handy little magnetic level, and that's about spot on. 21 degrees is what I was looking for. 21.25. So we'll maybe give it just a fraction more while it's still got some heat in it. There is of course still tension in this, so if you go over, there, I'm happy with that. So now we'll let that cool down, and then we will cut the piece for in the top here. Now we need to cut the piece of tube for the top. Now we have an odd sort of curve here, and they're more or less right angles. So it's not that easy to eyeball it to make the cut, and I'm not one of these people who can just look at a piece of tube, cut a curve in it and it fits. So I came up with this little dodge a while ago. You put a piece of string or wire or whatever exactly along where you want the top of your piece of tube to go. Then you measure from here to know how long that section is, and you make yourself a little template which runs along the string and is the right size for there. You can then just put that on the end of your piece of tube, mark it up and cut it. Fortunately at this end we're basically at right angles to the tube, so you just cut a little piece of tube there. That will get you close enough so that a bit of grinding will help you get a perfect joint. Then we're going to take our bit of string off. I wouldn't inflict all that sawing and grinding on you, so I've actually already cut the tube. Get the string off here. You need to use the springiness that's in the frame, because it's actually got to go in there like that. Okay, nicely lined up. So it's in the centre. And there's our piece of tube ready to bronze in. Nice joint all the way around, no big gaps, so we should be fine to do the bronzing, which we'll do now. So that's nicely held in place. Once again, I won't bore you with all the welding, so I'll weld it up and then we'll start on doing the rear end. And here are the completed welds. There's the front one. Getting focus. There is the rear.